Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started here in just a minute. A big hearty welcome to MOCANN members and national industry leaders joining us today. As our audience gathers, we'll keep an eye on things and get started here in just about 60 seconds. I feel like there should be some music.
Yeah, waiting room music, elevator.
I would hum, but that would not be good.
Someone just needs to take like Willie Nelson and strip out the words. Just have instrumental.
I think Andy's got a beer. That's the right idea.
Iced tea. No.
Oh,
Too early out here.
I understand. Well, let's go ahead and get started. I know there's some more folks joining us, but we'll do intros and get everything going, and that'll give folks the ability to jump in and catch all the really good information that BDSA is going to share. So first of all, welcome and thank you for joining us today. Our webinar, Using Data and Insights to Help Create Winning Cannabis Brands and Markets. You guys know me, I'm Andrew Mullins, Executive Director of MOCANN Trade. For those that are outside of Missouri, we're also affectionately known as the Missouri Medical Cannabis Trade Association. And we're really pleased to partner and bring you an insightful and educational webinar from our friends and members of the Trade Association BDSA. If you're not familiar with BDSA, they are the premier cannabis market research firm providing the global view of the cannabis market of today and tomorrow. I'd like to introduce you to our presenters. Today with us is Andy Seeger. He's BDSA's Director of Insights and Analytics, and also Brendan Mitchell-Cheesebro. He is BDSA's Marketing Content Manager. Just so you know, we've accounted for some time at the end of the presentation for questions. So if you look at your GoToWebinar panel there, you should see a Q&A thing that drops down, and you can submit your questions there anytime during the session today. And we'll work to get to as many of those as possible at the end of the presentation. Also wanted to let you know that this session is being recorded. Both the entire session and the slides that are being presented will be provided to all attendees, I think, as early as tomorrow. So with that, let's get things started. We're going to turn it over to Andy and enjoy the session.
Thanks, Andrew. We'll just go through a little bit of introduction here about what we do, and Brendan will help us out on some of the talking points.
Awesome. Thank you, Andy, and thank you, Andrew. We're really excited to be here. So as Andrew mentioned, BDSA is a market research firm covering the global cannabinoid industry. We accomplish this with 3 core data products. We have our retail sales tracking product, which gives a granular coverage of 12 adult use and medical markets in the US, very soon expanding to 13 markets. We have our market forecasts, which provide a 5-year projection on the growth of all legal cannabis markets. So US, Canada, and global, but focusing on US and Canada, and we do segment out our US markets by channel and by category. So if you want to, for example, know how much flower sales in the Missouri market are going to be in 2025, our market forecast product can tell you that. And to round it out, we have our consumer insights product, which gives a detailed look into the consumer landscape across US and Canadian markets, covering everything from demographics to shopping behaviors and influencers of product choice. So next, please. So here's a great point to start out on. We're now almost at 80% of the adult population in fully legal states, adult use states, who have bought into consuming cannabis, meaning that they're current consumers, past 6-month consumers, or they're non-consumers who are open to consuming in the future. This is from spring 2022, and this is up from just 73% in fall of 2021. Now, when we compare this to more mature industries like bev alcohol, you can see that there's still significant growth opportunity, but greater than 50% of the population consuming is a really big deal. So we often get questioned about how frequently these people actually consume, and if they're the tried it once in the past 6-month types. Most of these are consuming weekly, if not at least daily. So from our CI product, we show that 65% of inhalables consumers, so flower, vape, pre-roll, claim to consume inhalables at least daily. And here we can take a little bit of a look at how legalization and the regulations are looking across the US currently. So when we take a look at the current legalization landscape, we see a huge difference now compared to what cannabis access was about 5 years ago. So we went from having a country that was mostly under prohibition with some islands of legalization to having most areas with legal access and some small islands of prohibition. Another way to look at this is that about 3/4 of US adults have access to some sort of legal cannabis. And for those who live in more restricted markets, legal cannabis is usually just a short drive away. And I'm sure that my colleague Andy can attest the number of cars with Texas plates that he sees in New Mexico dispensary parking lots.
Absolutely.
On to the next one. And here's one of the ways we like to sort of bucket legal cannabis markets when we think about them analytically. There's some markets that are very mature. They've been medical for a long time, sometimes over 20 years. These are markets like California, Oregon, Colorado. Many of these markets were operating like an adult use market in some ways before they even moved to adult use. So those are very developed, brands very established, trends fully set in stone, or mostly. Then we have newer markets, which started up more recently under medical, were more restricted for a longer period of time, and have more recently launched adult use. Then we have what I think are some of the more exciting markets, which are emerging markets. These are markets like New York, New Jersey, and also Missouri that recently launched, are seeing a whole lot of growth and are seeing a huge expansion in their industry and more sophistication every day. And
yeah,
I'll
thank
pass
you,
it on.
Brendan. Oh, sorry, I overwrote you there, but thank you, Brendan. And exactly on that note, we're seeing an acceleration in timelines. I think one thing we can all point to is the impact that COVID had. Governments during COVID moved very, very fast, faster than they ever have on cannabis before, and then that came to a screeching halt. We saw cannabis workers become described as, essential. We saw curb sales being allowed in Illinois very early on in its adult use cycle, all other things to try to give these pressure valves to these fledgling markets. But the government's really developed a lot of things very quickly and then just stopped. They are rather risk adverse, but they are learning best practices from each other, efficiencies. They're getting less risk adverse as that tax revenue comes in. So these things are kind of accelerating in timing, in going from no market at all to possibly a medical market to possibly a full AU market, like we've seen in maybe Montana or something, or even some that are still hanging out. Hawaii has the longest running medical only market in the country. There's not many indications that might open up to AU adult use sales anytime soon, but the rest of the country really is moving pretty rapidly. Arizona, with their referendum that they had in late 2020, and then switching on sales almost just 3 months later. So when we take a look at Missouri, Missouri legalizing in 2018 through the legislature, and then in 2020 having actual sales, it's been kind of a mix of some heavy regulations with some kind of hands-off things, as the state doesn't seem to have overwritten some rules. There are minimums, unlike some other states that have caps. Illinois, again, deals with some minimums. It has a cap of 500 licenses. It's still only at 150. We've seen better in Missouri, that 203, I think it's now 204 retail count with about 89 processors and 65 grows is a pretty good, structural foundation for this market. We would like to see some more canopy expansion, more size expansion there, a little bit more players in the game to try to get at some of this consumer penetration. But a $9 gram is pretty good for a medical market here. We have seen some decreases in pricing there, so there may be some price pressure in the future. But year to date, the growth is over 200%, which we should expect in kind of a year two. They are going to be lapping some kind of similar values here in the second half of the year, so we should expect that 200% year-to-date growth kind of decline to maybe 150, 100, but it definitely is growing at a pretty good pace here. And then when we look at category splits for Missouri, this is very much an indication of market maturity. Flower has been declining across the board in every market. It is now down under the majority in most markets. It's not rare to see that, but early on in a medical market, for flower to be below 50% is a good indicator that both the consumers and the market are rather mature. We see this number, the 49%, go down into the low 30s in some legacy markets. especially as that flower price goes into the kind of $4 to $5 a gram range, and the value proposition of other goods becomes higher. We're seeing in California where rosins and other kind of higher order concentrates are making their way into other produced and infused products. So edibles with higher order cannabinoids in them, rosins, other things, that value add is being pushed down as the price of flower is also coming down. So that maturity mix will certainly start to change or shift, and it already has. We track it in our data, and it's something that we provide monthly, but we should start to see some more onset of these more processed goods, concentrates, dabbables becoming much more popular on the West Coast. Edibles have gotten much better with their science and their onset and their bioavailability and their dosage and their clarity, and they're really the only space that's able to brand as the brand and the packaging is right there when you use the product, which is not often the case with other formats. So we look to those spaces, and we look to drinks. Drinks are relatively small right now, but they're really coming on. The science behind it has advanced quite quickly. Keith Villa has his light beer. The founder or the owner, or the guy that invented Blue Moon, has a THC beer that he claims hits like a light beer with 10 milligrams. There in Missouri, the Show Me State, the Budweiser state, I'm sure there's huge interest on beverages. I can say, being from St. Louis, there is nothing better than a Bud Heavy at Busch Stadium on a hot day. That's not quite possible with cannabis yet. So that idea of where cannabis could be and those experiences that you could have outside of the usage right now will also start to impact some of these format and the choices that consumers have along the way. When we look across other markets, we are seeing some softening. So adult use markets in Montana and New Mexico that have opened up this year have seen some slight softening in sales. Illinois was kind of the first market to see a decline month over month in its first year. We're now starting to see that softness in some other markets, potentially as these markets kind of share consumers. These markets, as Brendan alluded to with the map earlier, are now bordering places that have not had access before. Rhode Island here is an example, likely losing some patient participation to a completely open Massachusetts market where the patient consumers could find ease rather than maybe the tax avoidance or the medicinal products that they want within their own market. Also, being on the border of Texas, New Mexico is going to grab some of that sales from Texas. It's going to siphon off some of that sales that came from Texas into Colorado. I've certainly had people in my dispensary with Texas accents ask each other if they need anything and say, oh no, I'm completely good. I'm full up. I've got gummies at home. So it definitely is the cross-market sales coming to bear. And we see that when we kind of look at Illinois, just next door to Missouri here, about a third to a quarter of their sales in any given month are to the out-of-state residents. They do track that with their scanning of IDs and driver's license. So the points like Beloit, Wisconsin, and Gary, Indiana, and East St. Louis, they're really driving between a quarter to a third of sales in Illinois. So that's what could potentially be happening if Missouri, does come out of this with some sort of adult use market in the next. We forecast out to 2026. The possibilities of that are to be debated. But if they were to come out, the market to your east is a very good proximity of what's happening, especially given that they're doing almost the same monthly sales that Illinois is doing about right now. Illinois' medical market was very constrictive before, so that it makes sense that it's kind of on the level of a Missouri now in that kind of $30 million a month range. So we can, Missouri right now as it stands has about 50 more retail locations and about half the population of Illinois. So there is room to grow for this medical market. There is a lot of groundwork already set that could be the foundation of a pretty robust, full integrated market. And like we said before, is Missouri kind of a model for other markets as these markets start to accelerate, as things and oddities like Oklahoma having 2,000 dispensaries and a 7% population or patient percentage population, those oddities start to stretch and change what we think about in the industry and what legislators start to think about. So these timelines are advancing, they are increasing and accelerating, and Missouri can be kind of the an example of that in the Midwest, an example of something that has come from the legislature. They haven't had too much interest in it, but they've built a structure that's relatively hands-off in terms of just having minimums and allowing some licensing structure to go forward, it just becomes a question of what is the next step then and how you work with the legislature to go forward. But definitely the foundations are there for this market, and the market is proving itself in robustness, even if there are a few pinch points. And when we look at some of the the outlook for this, flower now down near about $9 a gram. That's likely, as we would expect that as firms come into the market. These SKU numbers, these increases from prior, from early in the market, way up. You're now having that full shelf for consumer, that full availability of products where they can actually have choice and are no longer just taking the thing that's on shelf because it's on shelf. So that $9 a gram is likely to sustain some high sales for now, but there is indications of decline, and we do see legacy markets averaging out at about $4 or $5. So there is some room below that $9 that it could come down, and is coming down in the past year or so. But more markets opening up will also pressure that price down. So what is captured in this market during this time is kind of going to be indicative or dependent on what that dollar per gram price is, what the availability is. I think the availability is there with 203 stores. That's a rather robust number comparing it to other states that might be either oversaturated or undersaturated. But the possibility is definitely there in the state. And then Brendan has put together some things that are in the market for you guys.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Andy. So here's an overview of some of the top brands that we're seeing across all markets that we cover. It's important to note that this is not a ranked list of top brands. This is just a selection of brands that are among the top 25 performers across all BDSA tracked markets. So there's a couple of trends that pop out when we look at these list of brands here: Steezy, Select, Jeter, Wild, and Rhythm. One is that multi-state operators are heavily featured in the list of top 10 brands across all markets, especially brands with a presence in 3 or more markets, especially if one of those markets is a larger market like Illinois or California or Colorado, or a really fast-growing market. Brands in these markets are able to gain share faster than brands that focus on dominating a single market. So examples of these are Rhythm, started out in Illinois; Wild, Select, and Steezy both started out in the California market, expanded to new product categories, new markets. Brands that also focus on popular form factors will see a quick rise to the top. This is the case in Steezy and Jeter. So Jeter, which is a Field of Dreams brand founded in California, mostly focused on the infused pre-roll market, which is a really rapidly growing subcategory in pre-roll. They've since branched out in flower, concentrates, now planning expansion into other markets. Same deal with Steezy. Steezy, mostly focused on vape products, have expanded to have a whole product portfolio that goes way beyond vapes, now have their own retailers in California, and they're expanding across the country. So this is just a selection of some of the characteristics of top brands that we see across markets. And now we can go into some about Missouri specifically. So some similar trends that we're seeing here. Much like in mature markets and much like in the aggregate that we showed you in the last slide, brands that focus on the most popular form factors like vapes, flower, pre-roll are seeing the most success. Brands in larger markets have been able to bring in a lot of revenue by gaining a dominant share in a really niche category like topicals, maybe infused beverages. In the California market, we've seen some brands focus on a niche of a niche. An example of this that comes to mind is Cann, C-A-N-N, which mostly focused on low dose or micro dose beverages. And they've been able to sort of leverage their success with that small category in California to expand across to different markets and to get into other beverage categories aside from the low dose stuff. When you're looking at a market like Missouri, brands that are going to see the biggest returns are ones that invest more in the sort of steak and potato sort of categories. So flour, premium flour, pre-roll, vapes, concentrates. Those are the things that all consumers and the heaviest consumers generally look for according to our consumer data. And those are the things that are going to give the most sizable, consistent returns. MSO presence is relatively low in Missouri compared to a lot of other markets, especially some of the fellow Midwestern markets like Illinois. Part of this is likely due to limited licensing and the market being in its early stages, but we do expect M&A activity to interest in M&A activity in Missouri to sort of pick up in the next couple of years. And next, please. So the rise of rosin and solventless, this is another trend that we're picking up in products specifically in California, Colorado, a lot of mature markets where you have really educated consumers, heavy consumers. People might describe themselves as connoisseurs. Rosin was something that was typically only seen in dabbables and vape cartridges. Now it's available in edibles across a number of markets, and with a focus on gummies. Rosin gummies have really blown up in the past couple of years. Solventless edibles are a really good example of brands, of products that use premium inputs as a cue for quality. So when consumer education improves, there's going to be more and more consumers who prioritize quality over just THC levels, over price point. And brands are going to be able to capitalize on those consumers by using cues like solventless, using cues like rosin, talking about live resin, these kind of things that these consumers want. And another trend that we're seeing is minor cannabinoids. So minor cannabinoids, if you talk to the average consumer 3 years ago, they'd say, oh yeah, CBD. It's really expanded since then. We've seen a huge growth in CBN products. We've seen a huge growth in CBG products. We've seen more other minor cannabinoids like THCV come onto the market. 6 of the top 20 California SKUs for edibles have either CBG or CBN in them. Kiva and Wild CBN SKUs, 2 leading brands across Colorado and California, are #1 and #2 in the California market. And as consumers become more knowledgeable about these minor cannabinoids, similar to with the solventless products, they'll be looking for these products because they know that minor cannabinoids are things that can drive consistent, repeatable experiences. If you go and you buy a gummy or any sort of edible for sleep, not all indicas are created the same. Even if you're buying flower and it's the same strain by 2 different manufacturers, generally you're going to have a different experience. But one of the pluses with minor cannabinoids that consumers are starting to realize is that 5 milligrams of CBN is 5 milligrams of CBN. You're going to have that consistent, repeatable experience. And this is something that we know from our consumer data brings consumers back and builds brand loyalty. And that pretty much wraps up the talk about brands and products. And we're closing in on the end here, so I'll throw it back to Andy.
Yeah, and I think a point here is also that this is where branding is really kind of winning, and one of the few formats where branding is winning like this, where branding can succeed. This packaging that follows you to the experience that people are having, to the rituals that they're having when they do take these things. It's not necessarily true when you have a pre-roll or the vape that comes out of the box and you don't have what it is on the cartridge, or unless it's got the associated pen, or anything else that just doesn't have the branding right there. These Camino tins, the Plus tins, the other things can easily fit in a purse or a pocket and follow you around, and the use case is right there. So it's an interesting practice in branding and product development. But yeah, kind of wrapping up, I think we had talked about looking at Illinois as kind of a proxy, but also Michigan. The original intent in the Missouri market to have 51% local ownership of some parts of the business, even though it's vertically integrated in places, was, you know, we do like to see that those sorts of things. We know it was litigated away, but those are the sort of things that indicate to us there are going to be more local firms that compete, much more like a Michigan that has a Detroit Brownie Company and other things that have allowed their kind of market to open up and expand in terms of firms to the point where they're now on the level with sales with Illinois, despite having millions of fewer people. They've really expanded their market to a lot more participation instead of the captive market that's in Illinois. That's really kind of restricting sales. So when we look at Missouri and we kind of wrap everything up, you know, having a cannabis-centered market in the heartland is pretty new. You know, we have Oklahoma there, obviously, and they have gone with their laissez-faire, all hands off kind of approach to cannabis. But having something regulated and steady with that somebody can templatize or look to as a model for their own is kind of rare. And this could be that in this area for the foreseeable future. If the growth continues to happen, if we see that maturity, if we see people continue to you know, build up these firms and compete and drive product innovation into the hands of customers. But to see that, we're really going to need to see a little bit more patient participation, or have that consumer participation come in from an AU possibility. expansion of canopy going to be a very big thing that will need to be realized. You do see the kind of leveling off of some of the sales in the last few months here in the state. We can see in the Illinois data where canopy space is realized because the state sales will jump for a number of months and plateau. That really indicates to us that somebody's canopy has come online. They've had 14 weeks of having a flower and now are able to supply, but that supply is the kind of limiter there. So a similar thing here where the number of growers to the number of outlets could be really limiting the number, just the amount of purchasing that can happen with a 3% patient participation. But overall, the market's steady and growing, and then looking forward to what the possibilities are with the unknowns going forward with the legislature. But certainly an interesting and fun market. And with that, we would love to field any questions.